Good afternoon. Thank you all for watching this recording. And again, apologies for earlier today. As you can see, we are joined by our guest, Luke Grunman. Luke, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for kind of navigating bizarre tech realities. What's important is that we are able to have this conversation. So for
Yeah,
those of you
absolutely.
just joining and who are less familiar with our two organizations, I'll go ahead and introduce myself and talk a little bit about Urban Homeworks, and then Luke, it would be great for you to do the same. So my name is AsaleSol Young, and I'm the Executive Director of Urban Homeworks. Urban Homeworks has been working in affordable rentals for around 30 years. We have 136 units of housing that serves families making 20 to 50% of the area median income. And that houses roughly 400 people in the Twin Cities. We also do affordable development for housing, for home ownership, for folks making less than 80% AMI, which is area median income. At the center of our work is community development and housing justice. And so we consider ourselves to be very much led by what is happening in the community and what is happening in the lives of our residences. And so today I'm really excited to have this conversation because we are joined by Luke Grundman, who is the current litigation director for Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid. And Luke, I know that that's a fairly new title for you. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your work with Legal Aid.
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. And I'll apologize to your viewers. Sounds like the technical difficulties were mostly on my end, so I'm sorry about that. And thanks for having me. Absolutely, yes. So Legal Aid, hopefully a lot of folks know about us. We've been around for 105 years, 106 years now. We provide free legal services to people who can't afford lawyers, and we don't do criminal law, but we do a pretty big swath of other kinds of law when people need access to justice, access to courts, and that includes family law, it includes immigration law, it includes government benefits law, youth law, senior law. We have a disability law center. There are always units that I will miss if I try to name them all, so I won't. We've got 75 lawyers and then almost that same number of other staff. We've got offices all over the state. Minneapolis is our headquarters, and it's our hometown, our community. We've put a lot of energy and focus into North Minneapolis in particular, and we have been, I'd like to think, good partners with Urban Homeworks over the past several decades, I think now. And my experience with that has been mostly in housing. You asked about my current role. I'm litigation director now, which is a little broader than just housing. Housing is one of our biggest areas of litigation at Legal Aid. But my role now includes some of the other things we do in court for folks. But pretty much the last 10 years have been almost exclusively housing. And I worked with Urban Homeworks in two different ways, just personally. I worked in the response to the foreclosure crisis, and Urban Homeworks did some excellent work in that area, providing counseling, providing loans and ways for people to get into housing and home ownership that they otherwise didn't have those opportunities. And that was a huge benefit to the community, and particularly North Minneapolis, just following the foreclosure crisis. After that, I did a couple of other different areas of law, and then wound up in our landlord tenant unit, managing that work. And in that work in our Minneapolis office, we'll represent around 3,000 families per year facing housing instability issues, and eviction defense is by far the greatest number, the most significant number of cases. We represent a ton of families facing eviction. We give people lawyers in court. We're there for as many families as we possibly can be. And along with our partners, for the past several years, we've been able to achieve right to counsel for all tenants, families facing eviction who meet certain income guidelines, but of course, most folks in facing eviction do. And so the most families have been able to get lawyers over the past several years, thanks to the work of the lawyers at Legal Aid and at the Volunteer Lawyers Network. And Hennepin County has been a big partner in that as well. And in our landlord tenant work, we have also been benefited by the partnership we've had with Urban Homeworks in a couple of different ways.
Yeah, no, that's great. And thank you for that history. And we have just really valued our partnership and just being able to look to you guys for that legal support for our folks that become our residents, moving out of buildings owned by problematic landlords, or just family of folks in our residences. And so just really grateful that we're able to do this work together. Speaking of I know eventually we're going to get into the eviction moratorium and rent help and all of that, but thinking about North Minneapolis specifically and just changes in the market, changes in sort of housing reality. We're seeing this influx of corporations coming in, buying property, and really curious from your side of that, Luke, what is it looking like for residents? How is it impacting the landscape of North Minneapolis?
That's a great question. And of course, it's through our partners like Urban Homeworks that we learn a lot about what's actually happening on the ground. And so I don't pretend to have a complete picture of it. Our vantage point as lawyers who represent families facing eviction is, some would say we only see the worst. We're only seeing things when it gets to that eviction stage, or when we're suing landlords who aren't providing the housing that the law requires in terms of health and safety requirements. So but from that vantage point, I can tell you it's been there has been this significant increase in corporate ownership of rental properties. And in some people out there would say that that's not such a bad thing, because it has in some ways displaced some of the slumlords that we had been dealing with years ago. And some that Urban Homeworks in particular helped with the management of big portfolios run by local individuals, but people who really were not taking care of their homes in ways that was really victimizing families. With the corporate landlords, I see a lot of analogies to that post foreclosure era, or that foreclosure crisis era, and how that impacted North Minneapolis, because the enemy wasn't a person that you could see, right? It wasn't someone that you could specifically say that they set out to prey upon individual people, which is absolutely what we've seen in the past. We've seen sexual predators become landlords in North Minneapolis and then engage in sexual harassment of tenants. And then you've got landlords who are preying upon tenants more in other ways, financial predators. This corporate system is, I mean, it's a machine. It's like trying to negotiate with a giant computer that sits in a different state and has been set up to maximize profit, period, to pull as much money out of North Minneapolis families as it possibly can. And so they are always doing everything they can to minimize their costs. And those costs can be things like treating pest infestations or treating mold infestations in homes. They immediately go to, what is the law? What will actually happen to them if they break the law? And if they break the law and can get away with it, they will, because it costs too much money to follow the law. Or if they pay for that, it eats into the profit margins. So what we see from corporate landlords is the maximization of profit over people. And that kind of machine generated profit seeking has the effect of creating housing that's in very bad condition, that's poorly maintained, families who then are subject to being evicted and turned over in high frequencies. Landlords like that hire law firms to do their evictions who will process cases in bulk. They'll have no ability or authority even to try to negotiate deals to try to keep families in their homes and make things better for them. Just the same way it was when we were negotiating with law firms representing large multinational banks post foreclosure. They would say, we don't have the authority to work out a deal or to do the right thing here. We don't have a human being that we can even pick up the phone and call to try to figure out what's actually best for this family or even this community, or engage in discussions like that. There's no one at the wheel. There's an algorithm that's running these portfolios.
Right. And so, it's adding to the displacement and the distrust of the system and the lack of capacity for folks to really stabilize within a community. And, what we find, and this as well, that the beauty of stable, dignified housing is what it gives people access to, right? It's like we all can imagine the lack of a roof over our heads and the daily, what that would look like for our children, but also, we know that would put us in crisis, but also recognizing how much is lost in just not being able to stay in one place and not being able to ensure that you are getting the healthcare that you need because you are connected to those resources, you're getting the education, access for yourself and for your children, job stabilization, etc. And so, it is interesting just to hear you kind of talk about even referencing corporate landlords parallel to, these larger problematic landlords that I think that folks have heard a lot about. And one of those cases, of course, that we worked on together was the case against Meldal, which is fairly recent. And, just the reality for Urban Homeworks is that a lot of times, like, residents are living in these conditions and really not knowing where they can turn to, and recognizing that they can't fight if they don't have stability. And having landlords, threaten them, if they decide to get into a process of justice, they'll be threatened, they'll be evicted. And so they need a place to go so that they can stay in that fight, and we can ultimately kind of start to abolish some of these problematic practices.
Yes, absolutely.
So, as one of the greatest tools that a problematic landlord has is an eviction. The benefit of the eviction for the owner is that they get to keep that down payment. They get to collect another one in a short amount of time, and they don't really have to deal with the ramifications of you as the resident having that on your record. So it's a pretty, economically, it works really well for an owner, and it really makes life harder for folks making, for example, those in our housing, 20 to 50% of the area median income. You already struggle to find housing that honors your humanity, and now you have an eviction on your record. So we have this wonderful moratorium for the sake of COVID, which I think was something really great for folks. And we know it's ending, all of the supports, everything around it is kind of wrapping up. Are you able to, just for our audience, different folks are going to be tuning in, maybe start with explaining to folks what is a moratorium, when that happens, what are kind of the rules around timelines, what determines how long a moratorium lasts, and then we'll go from there.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So in this case, an eviction moratorium was something of a historic event. It hadn't happened in the past that in this case, the governor was the first to act, and then the federal government stepped up as well. And so there were people would talk about these eviction moratoria, and they're really talking about overlapping rules and laws that came from multiple different places, certain rules that applied to subsidized landlords and public housing versus private landlords. And but it was, all of them were it was a moment of everything coming together at the right time when it came to the realization of what displacement does to people. And it was so great that you mentioned the health impacts and the stability impacts of what an eviction actually does. And I think that's a lot of people should get some credit for that. You know, Dr. Matthew Desmond wrote a book called Evicted that lays out some of those ramifications and how evictions themselves can be a cause of poverty and continued poverty, not just the result of poverty. Locally, Dr. Brittany Lewis of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs did a study focused on North Minneapolis that really laid some of that out. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it was that groundwork that led Governor Walz and nationally the Biden administration and the Center for Disease Control to say, for all those entities at this almost at the same time, to say, one thing we know we can't have during a global pandemic with case numbers skyrocketing and no vaccines and is people being evicted. And if in the fourth judicial district of Minnesota, which is Hennepin County, that was so obvious, because you could go down to the courthouse and you could watch 45 families all being evicted at the same time in the same courtroom. And just like that image, and then not to mention the impacts of what happens when they go home and have no home to go to. And the study shows that people will double up and triple up and congregate in shelters, and all of that was so antithetical to everything that society was doing to try to ameliorate the impacts of this pandemic. That But that doesn't negate that it was still an act of courage by elected leaders, and you know, and it's an important thing. And historically, it'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on, and to make sure that we don't lose that capacity in the aftermath. There's some court actions that are threatening to undercut the ability of government action like that to step up in an emergency, which is a tangent concern I don't want to deal with too much. But so the idea of an eviction moratorium was an emergency response to health impacts of what that would cause if people are displaced from their homes en masse, as was happening prior to the pandemic. And it, as you said, AsaleSol, it was a huge deal. It was a big deal to have that put on hold and stopped, to have evictions almost stopped. You know, from the beginning, there were exceptions for folks that were alleged to have committed crimes, you know, in the property, serious crimes. There were exceptions really throughout the pandemic, and those ebbed and flowed. You know, there were new ones added. Some were, it became clear were being exploited by landlords, and so some of the exceptions were ratcheted back. At Legal Aid, we represented a lot of families in court where landlords were trying to use those exceptions in ways that they weren't designed to be used. So there was a lot of that throughout that pandemic and moratorium period. And now we're in the last few months of the last protection of the state moratorium. There are still some protections that exist, and again, some new things that have been created to help families facing eviction, but we're almost to the end of the last protection that was created in that time period.
Yeah, and so to your point, you know, a lot of things have shifted pretty drastically from the beginning to now. Sort of like you said, we're heading towards the end. What are some of those shifts? And just really curious, again, similar to my previous question, just how legal aid, what is legal aid seeing on the side of the resident with these shifts?
Yeah, good question, and timely, because there was, you know, a lot of debate about like what would happen once the moratorium lifted. Would there be a sudden tsunami of evictions, all this pent up demand for landlords to evict people, and that did not happen. Well, and what I should say is it didn't happen right away. It's
Mhm.
happening now. The eviction filing rate in Minneapolis has exceeded its pre-pandemic levels at this point. So it didn't shoot through the roof as soon as the protections were lifted. The most significant event that led to the increase of eviction filings was when the state of Minnesota announced that it had run out of funds to put into its RentHelp Minnesota program. I want to make sure that right as soon as I say that for viewers, that there are still funds available for people who live in Minneapolis. It's still though that announcement by the state that yes, we had at some point they had almost a $500 million of rent assistance, mostly from the federal government. When they announced that they were halting applications to that state-run program, we saw a stampede by landlords to start filing evictions. And so where we're at now is there are still some natural choke points in terms of slowing it down from from astronomical levels of evictions being filed all at once. But we are in a period where we're above how many evictions were filed prior to the pandemic. And the process has a few choke points, like landlords, for the most part, need to hire lawyers to file eviction cases. Those lawyers are at the limits of their capacity. So that's one of the choke points. The court can really only process so many cases at once. We're starting to hit those limitations. So there are um, some ways that, at least in the city of Minneapolis, that we don't think that the rate will exponentially continue to grow, but it certainly is already at unsustainably high levels, and it's probably got room to grow from where it is now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the kind of final, people have until what, June, until it's completely back to what we consider sort of a normal run of show with landlords and tenants. Is that correct?
That's right. And the last restriction is that landlords are not allowed to file or proceed with eviction cases if the family who's living in that home has applied for some form of rent help related financial assistance. And those applications, even now, can still be submitted through Hennepin County. So there are still some dollars that are available, and families, if they're struggling, should get those applications in as soon as possible. The act of having applied will protect a family from eviction until June. But we're, as you pointed out, we're in the last, few weeks of that protection. So
Yeah.
very soon that won't exist anymore. And the unfortunate reality of when that happens is that there are landlords who use eviction in the court process as effectively a bill collection exercise. And unfortunately, it's the large corporate landlords who do that more than others. Steve Meldal certainly has done that as well. So it's not just the big corporate landlords,
Mhm.
but there are landlords out there who they just they'll file the eviction as soon as the rent is late. And from their perspective, it's like, well, we can force the tenant to reimburse us for the costs of filing the eviction. So we don't have a real reason not to. At least that's how the computer algorithm processes this information, is we just go ahead and file the case, and we'll probably come out even if the tenant family does manage to come up with the money from family, friends, the government, et cetera. But the real social impact of that is tremendous. And the eviction records, and how those eviction records feed the very dark underbelly of predatory landlords who are out there, who really prey upon families who have no other options because they've got eviction records. And that's what allows some of the extremely predatory landlords who've taken advantage of families in North Minneapolis, allows them to continue, especially the ones who've engaged in sexual harassment of their tenants and that sort of thing. It's those types of land, no one rents that housing if they have other opportunities, and those landlords would be put out of business if the eviction system was fixed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to have that conversation with you one day as well. But to consider those watching who are tenants, are renters, and maybe dealing with a landlord that just assumes they don't have knowledge of the system, assumes that they don't know the process. Are there any pointers or advice that you would give those folks to navigate a landlord like that?
Very good. Good question. Yes. I mean, the first thing would be to apply for the for rent assistance. That having that application, if you're behind on rent, applying for that, for those funds, the sooner the better, will give protections. And that's true even if it's past June. So it's not like once it's past June, don't even try. The county, Hennepin County, gets regular appropriations of funding to help with people who are facing emergency situations. So getting those applications in and started is a very good way to head off the ultimate eviction. And then the only other thing is that you should get a lawyer. Like I said, between us and the county and volunteer lawyers, pro bono attorneys, there are free lawyers available. And sometimes people, I think, hear that and they think, well, a free lawyer probably isn't a very good lawyer because there's that's a reality sometimes that exists out there. But I'll tell you that the lawyers at Legal Aid work very hard and they're very good at what they do, and at our partner organizations as well. And having that lawyer, even if you think you may not need one, that it's a simple dispute, we can help make sure that when you leave court, that eviction will be off your record, so it doesn't narrow your housing options going forward. We can help you arrive at settlement agreements, even if you don't want to go to trial, don't want to have a long drawn out battle in court. You think, I don't need a lawyer. We can still help you get a lot better settlement and a lot better outcome for you and your family. So getting in touch with a lawyer would be trying to get the funds and then get in touch with a lawyer. Two very important things. Besides that, one other good thing I tell folks is take lots of pictures and communicate in writing as much as you possibly can with your landlord. And if that's by text message, that's okay. Keep your text messages, try not to lose the phone, or take screenshots of important text messages and save those. Even if some landlords don't want to communicate in writing because they know it all might show up in court someday. So just insist on it. And if they want to talk by phone, confirm it in writing. Write an email that says, this is what we talked about, and here's the understanding going forward. Here's what's going to happen, and confirm it in writing, even if they insist on not communicating in writing in other ways.
That's great, Luke. Thank you so much for just kind of mapping that out for folks, because I know that when you don't know and you're up against a lot of money, it's incredibly intimidating. And so I do encourage folks that are watching this to, as Luke said, to reach out to Legal Aid directly. You can also reach out to Urban Homeworks and we can connect you if that's helpful. The Housing Justice Center is another great resource, another advocate and partner in this work that you can reach out to, and as well as LawHelp Minnesota. So I just am really grateful for this conversation. I know that it had a delayed start, but really grateful for your time with us today. And just, hopefully like this conversation really helps to ground folks in what's to come in the short term around this moratorium actually fully wrapping, and what needs to happen. And so if you or someone you care about is dealing with a problematic landlord, a bully landlord, and they have done their process, please advise them, guide them toward the resources that we will also put in the, when we post this, we will have those resources linked. Any last advice, or when we think about the folks who are not in this predicament, ways that they might be able to show up and support their neighbors, any advice for those folks?
Yeah, I think that it's amazing when we see the power of the community coming together and and focusing on who the real enemy is. And so I guess what I would suggest is that, and I lived in North Minneapolis for 7 years, and there sometimes gets to be this concern about like a problem property, and then the attention gets focused on the tenants who are living in that property. And I just encourage people to think about instead getting to know the folks who are living there, and then maybe you might realize that the real problem is the landlord and not the family that's being victimized by predatory landlords out there. And so that's one suggestion, is if you are watching, you're not a tenant, but you know about properties that seem to be concerns, maybe get in touch with them and see if there's ways that you can help and work with them to try to make things better for everybody.
That's such beautiful advice, very community centered, and it came from a lawyer. And yes, I have lots of jokes about lawyers, but thank you for that.
Absolutely.
We are building community, and we do it by relationship, and we do it by talking to each other, and actually learning and understanding each other. For those in the Urban Homeworks donor supporter viewership, we encourage you to not only follow Luke's advice, but also to go ahead and sign up for our Take Action emails if you have not done so already. These are ways for you to stay current on what is happening in North and South and St. Paul, Frogtown, St. Paul, where where Urban Homeworks has housing, and just to stay connected. And I also recommend that this is a long-term fight. Fighting for each other to have stability is an ongoing fight. In order for organizations like Legal Aid to stay in that fight, they need financial support. So I encourage you to check them out, donate. Unapologetic plug here.
Good.
To donate for the organizations that you believe in, that are doing the work that you know matters. And of course, that includes Urban Homeworks, that includes Legal Aid, but it also includes some of the organizations that we've mentioned that are helping residents on the ground stay stable and without evictions on their records. So thank you all so much for being here, for watching. We look forward to your questions. And Luke, I look forward to doing this with you again.
Yes, this was fun. Thanks for having me, and anytime. And I will minimize the technical problems for the next one. So thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you.